This little bit of parkland sits beside Halifax Harbor. Once it was filled with the sounds of community life. It was called Africville, and although it disappeared back in 1969, it's not forgotten. Back about 1930, a small girl named Ruth Johnson planted an apple tree by the barn in her backyard. Not a strange thing to happen in a community, but in Africville, it was an act of faith. But to understand Ruth's story, it's important to understand Africville. About 400 people lived here in this Nova Scotia community, most of them descendants of slaves who had jumped ship, others who came here with the Empire Loyalists. In the 1840s, they bought land and began building their homes, helter-skelter, up the hillside from the harbor. They were proud people whose roots lay in the teachings of the Baptist Church. But from the beginning, they were misunderstood by the rest of the community of Halifax.
And they used to say, "Where is Africville?" I said, now this is the name of Africville, whether it is original or not.
The relationship between Africville's citizens and the rest of the community was often the topic of sermons given by the late Deacon Ralph Jones.
And some said, well, we heard that it was a place that you couldn't hardly go through it. Why? It was so dangerous that the name sounded like Africa, I suppose, where the jungles, where those wild people live.
If the community seemed wild to the outside world, it wasn't without reason. Life was tough in Africville. Back in the 60s, there was an old saying that where the pavement stopped, Africville began. It seemed that everything else stopped at the boundaries, too. Although they paid city taxes, residents of Africville didn't get water, sewage, or garbage pickup like the rest of Halifax. What they did get was the city dump and the rats and the smoke that came with it. In the early 60s, city officials decided to move the people out of Africville. There was some talk about bettering the lot of the residents, but there was another motive. The city needed the land for access to a new bridge that would cross Halifax Harbor. The proposal was pitched at meetings held in the church. Many of the people in Africville had built their homes on ancestral land and had no registered deeds. To them, it was a legal formality that seemed irrelevant. Those people were offered $500 to get off the land. The offer angered and outraged one of the community's most outspoken members, Daisy Carvery.
The meanest part that they did to Africville, they got the older people, the old people together. They didn't want to hear anything from the younger generation because they simply knew that the older people didn't have any education. What is $500 to a 75-year-old Negro? He thinks he's rich.
Daisy Carvery died in 1986, but today, her son Irvin continues to battle with the city.
We used to walk the tracks like this here when we lived out here, when I was old as you. We used to walk around.
Irvin Carvery was his son's age when the family was forced out of their home.
We used to see who could walk the tracks the furthest. And we used to do this here for hours on end.
You know, I get asked the question, it's 22 years later, why now? And the answer to that question is quite simple. The traumatic experience of the relocation of Africville on the people was that great that it's taken this long for the people to finally get over it and get back into themselves where they're able to organize and start saying that, hey, we were mistreated.
2 decades later, Africville's people not only believe they were cheated out of their land, but they still feel a loss of dignity.
There were numerous different tactics. One of the more popular ones that they used was if you and I were neighbors and you decided finally to sell your home and sign the paper, and if I was still a holdout, what they would do is they would sign this afternoon with you, then the next day they would get you moved, and then the very next morning what I would wake up to would be the sound of a bulldozer crashing through your house, knocking down your house. That's what I woke up to. And at the same time that I looked out to see what was going on, there'd be a man there from the city, And he would say, well, you know, are you going to sell? Are you ready to sell your property yet? And if you're not, because if you don't, we're going to expropriate your land. And if we have to expropriate, we're going to bulldoze on your house, and you won't get an opportunity to get anything out of it. And they actually did that to a couple of houses in Africville.
They took our homes. They moved us out of Africville. The city moved us out of Africville in the city garbage trucks. They moved us from Africville in city garbage trucks to get us out of Africville.
When you left Africville, when you got on the truck, you didn't think anything about it, right? But once you crossed into the city proper and started going down the street that you were now going to live on, and you've seen the looks of the people who, your neighbors, your new neighbors watching you arrive, you start to feel funny, you know, like you were pointed out and now you're going to be marked for the rest of your life with this here move.
That move marked the end of Africville in 1969. The land is now a park. The little girl who planted the apple tree is 72 now. Ruth Johnson grew up to be one of the community's most outspoken critics of the destruction of Africville.
They say you could never fight City Hall, but if City Hall had a group of honest, God-believing people, they would have never did this to us. Because you take and live on a land for 140-some years, and then the city said they need it for a bridge. They didn't even need the land for a bridge, because you can see where the bridge is, see where the cairn is. The people go to still live there.
For the last 2 decades, Ruth has visited the park to touch the last tangible evidence of her home. For years, she never missed an opportunity to talk about her apple tree.
Just imagine 41 years, 42 years that our people preserved that parcel of land, and you don't think we love it, even if it's a park? I still love that. I get a good feeling because I know they didn't tear up my apple tree. It's still there. I planted the apple tree there.
This year, she took the Real Stories crew to see her tree.
I told you my tree was here. Now it's gone. It's full of spruce trees. But now the tree's gone. But that's what you get for talking about things. Because, see, a landmark is a landmark. And maybe they take that away from you, and then they figure that you'd forget. But you never forget anything, something that you growed up with. If I lived to be 100 years, I think I could still picture Africville.
2 decades later, and the city is planning to put a road through the park. Former residents and their descendants still find new ways to protest. Ruth Johnson's tree may be gone, but the problems of Africville just won't go away.